Good afternoon and welcome to the 2020 NC Realtors State of the Real Estate Conference. I'm your 2020 North Carolina Realtors President, Maren Brisson-Kuster, coming in live from Charlotte, in my office in Charlotte nonetheless. So I'm glad so many of our membership and leadership have signed in today for this fantastic two-day event. It's really extremely timely. And as many of you know, 2020 has been an interesting year, right? And I wish we could all be together in person right now in the Sheraton Imperial Ballroom in Durham, but we can't. 2020, as usual, has brought the unexpected our way, so nothing is normal. But this conference, like our industry, is extremely resilient, and no hurricanes or global pandemics could truly stop it. And that's because we really have some important things to discuss, things that are facing our state today, right now, from Murphy to Manio. We all have the same issues in varying degrees. So this year's focus of this conference really goes to the core of who we realtors are, right? It's all about housing. We all know the challenges the housing industry has been facing, even prior to the pandemic, right? I mean, frankly, no inventory to speak of, more people moving to our area every day. Those inventory really disastrous low numbers are continuing to compel our market and increase market values. We're also seeing massive construction delays and millennials not buying homes because they're carrying large amounts of debt. And those are just a few of the issues we were all facing prior to this pandemic. That is, quite frankly, turned everything upside down as we once knew it. Our local economies, our state economy, our national economy, housing falls deeply entrenched in that. And so what does this mean to us and how does it look? We're in very uncertain times right now. And really coupled with the COVID downturn, what is the state of real estate going to look like here in the next 3 months, 6 months, a year from now? Where do we go from there, right? Over the next 2 days, we are going to hear from all the leading experts out there on how we might set up our state for success. And that also means how we can set up our local areas for success. We'll hear about challenges to providing enough housing for our residents that live here. And we are growing at a rapid pace. We will hear the steps certain communities have taken to improve housing in their areas and the impact of realtor advocacy on all these issues. And we will also have a very important conversation about what the current market really looks like from people who are paid to spend their days analyzing it. So they're not like some Sunday couch coach like I am, sitting there screaming at the Panthers on which pass play they should have called. They actually know what they're talking about. So take your notes, especially in that one, because I think you're going to need those talking points carrying forward. And just a quick note, we are recording every one of these sessions. And I know everyone's going to behave, so I'm not actually warning you about that. I'm letting you know that it will be recorded and put in the portal where you go to attend this meeting. So afterwards, you can go and watch any of these sessions again or pay it forward and pass them on and watch them with some of your coworkers. So without further ado, I'd like to go ahead and kick this meeting off because we have a lot of important information to get going on. And we really have a leading voice right now in addressing housing challenges by joining forces with multiple partners. That's why we brought in Mike Kinsella. He's Executive Director of Up for Growth, a diverse coalition of housing and social justice advocates, of environmental organizations, housing producers, major employers, urbanists, and transit associations alike. He really brought them all to the table to work on addressing our nationwide housing shortage. He's an expert in urban development and housing policy with over 15 years of experience in housing, commercial real estate investment, capital markets, and asset management. There's so much more I could actually go on and say about him, but if you haven't already checked out the bio on the portal, go look, because I don't want to drone on. I want to actually get going to the meat and potatoes of our presentation and get him in right now to really start addressing us and helping us figure out how we can make our state better. So before he begins, I want to remind everyone, there's a Q&A tab. There's a little button. Most of you, it's on the top right of your screen. Click that and please enter any questions you may have. We will get them answered and address as many as we can until time runs out today. Without any further ado now at this point, I'm going to turn the screen on over to Mike so he can take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Maren. I really appreciate the introduction. And I think you did a fantastic job setting the stage for what a critical issue North Carolina faces, along with the rest of the nation, in terms of our housing shortage and affordability crisis. I'm going to turn now to my presentation screen. And we'll get this kicked right off. So thank you again to the North Carolina Realtors. I'd really like to thank the whole team, particularly Mark Zimmerman and Rachel for doing a fantastic job pulling this, this event together. So by way of background, my name is Mike Kinsella, and I'm the Executive Director, as Maren mentioned, of Up for Growth. Up for Growth is a national Washington, D.C. based 501c3 pro-housing policy and research member network. And what that means is that we're really focused on bringing the many different constituencies to the table that Maren mentioned, but notably missing from that list were the realtors. NAR has been a great partner of the organization, as have many state and local realtor organizations around the country. So again, it's really an honor to have the opportunity to address this group. Today, I'm really going to focus on North Carolina's housing shortage and affordability crisis, how it impacts each and every person that is on this call, and what you can do to fix it. So to start, America faces a severe and increasingly severe housing affordability crisis. Many of you know the numbers. Just from a wide swath perspective, the nation as a whole has seen cost burdens for households around the country increase from roughly a quarter back in 1960s to 50% of households in the 2010s. As you look at the map, and this map really depicts county by county incidences of cost burdening, which is households paying more than 30% of their gross paycheck on housing costs, that both coasts are a sea of red, but increasingly the Midwest and Southeast are experiencing higher and higher cost burdens. In North Carolina, as you'll see in the detail, cities of Charlotte, Greensboro, and Raleigh are all experiencing increasing incidences of cost burdening for renters and homeowners alike. And why is this? The popular narrative is that it's greedy landlords or opportunistic developers or investors that are driving unaffordability. And the reality is clearly more complicated. We believe that one of the major drivers of unaffordability across the country is that housing production just isn't meeting housing needs. It's not meeting demand. As we see in this chart, housing production over the years have really slowed nationally, and that slowdown has become much more pronounced since 2000. So the long-term trend of housing production relative to household formation, which is one of the key demand drivers for housing, is 1.15 new homes built for every one new household formed. So someone graduates college and goes and gets their first apartment. A new couple gets married and they go out and find their first house. These are household formation events. And traditionally, the building industry has produced 1.15 new homes for each of those new household formation events. And as you can see in this chart, there's of course ebbs and flows in the real estate cycle. But from 1964 to 2008, the US produced 1.15 new homes for each new household formed. And that makes sense because not only do you need to keep up with that new demand, but you also have to make up for economic and physical obsolescence over time, as well as vacancy in the rental and home ownership markets. Post-World War II, so starting in the 1950s, America really optimized its land use policies to prioritize residential development in suburban and drivable greenfield locations. And this land use pattern is really codified in local land use and zoning regulations that persist to this day. At the same time, in 2000, America really experienced a return to the cities phenomenon. This is particularly visible in places like Charlotte, where there's been a real boom throughout the urban core in the north end of the city, as the city has made investments in infrastructure and transportation, and millennials have flocked to work downtown, and frankly, they want to live near where they work. The concept of an 18-hour or 24-hour city has become much more prevalent, not just in big cities like New York and San Francisco, but all sorts of places like Nashville and Charlotte and Kansas City. And so we've really, as a nation, seen this huge demographic shift and consumer preference shift to more infill housing, row house developments, walkable urban communities, even master planned communities, really with a heavier emphasis on placemaking and walkable amenities. And of course, the boom in production of condominium and multifamily ownership product in places like Charlotte over the past 20 years. So that's really been a turning point in the dynamics around the housing market. Again, because of the land use policies and zoning policies really preferring suburban development, it has caused challenges in terms of delivering this type of newly in-demand product into walkable and urban areas. The global financial crisis of 2008, flash forward 7-8 years later, markets are melting down. We had a mortgage meltdown. We had a real drop-off, not only in the production of housing writ large, single family and multifamily, but we saw a depletion of institutional knowledge and the ability for the building industry to build housing. Land, in many cases, referred it to the senior most creditor. Banks took a lot of property back in the mortgage meltdown, and entitlements on those large-scale development sites burned off. And for smaller developers, access to capital was extremely limited. And so we saw from 2008 until 2016 a significant diminution on the level of housing production, falling all the way down to a rate of 0.6 homes built for every new household formed. So what happened is, over that period of time, is we saw significantly escalating cost burdens, significantly escalating rent. We saw a number of kids post-college just living with mom and dad for a prolonged period of time. And so this has really exacerbated a housing shortage or underproduction and led to the current state of affairs. In many ways, the global financial crisis was like COVID. It accelerated trends that were already underway. Today, if you look at the numbers from 2010 to 2019, our rate of production relative to new household formation has dropped to 0.93, which means every single year we are systemically underproducing homes relative to housing needs. And beyond affordability, there are significant costs of underproduction. From an economic output perspective, economist Enrico Moretti from Berkeley found that the US GDP is $2.1 trillion lower than it should be on an annual basis, were it not for the housing shortage and the lack of production of needed homes. From a federal revenue perspective, our research found that the national housing shortage results in the federal government, as well as through payroll and income taxes, not collecting $264 billion per year. And of course, with land use regulations inhibiting more housing in walkable, urban, and job-rich areas, that means more folks are continuing to drive until they qualify. And what that results in is more traffic congestion and cars off the road. From an environmental perspective, our estimate is that we could actually reduce cars on the road and CO2 emissions to the tune of 28% nationally if land use were better aligned with consumer preference, with where consumer preference and demand is today. From a national perspective, our research found that 23 states fell 7.3 million homes short of meeting need, as measured from 2000 to 2015. Now, of course, on your map, you'll see that depending on where you are, California or New York, or Idaho or Arizona, the extent of the underproduction or shortage of housing is quite different. You'll notice on this map that North Carolina is among the states that do not exhibit a statewide underproduction of homes. But as you'll see in the following slides, when you drill down to the metropolitan areas in the state, the story is quite different. So from a state perspective, looking at production, we observe that North Carolina's communities like Charlotte, Greensboro, and Raleigh have not kept up with growth. According to this data set, which looks at household formation versus housing production, from 2010 to 2019, the state as a whole ran at 1.1 units built for every household formed. Now that's in line with the national historic average. But as you drill down into Mecklenburg County, for instance, Charlotte and its surrounding communities fell 0.897 units to each new household formed, and so that's barely treading water. If you go up to Guilford County to Greensboro, you'll see that it's even lower. Only 9 homes on average built for every 10 households formed. And if you look at job creation, the picture gets a little bit bleaker than looking at it from a household formation perspective. Across the state, North Carolina, since 2010, has produced 1.4 jobs or created 1.4 jobs for every 1 housing unit built over that period of time. And those are net numbers. A normal rate of housing production to job creation ratio is 1. Now you do have double income households with more than 1 worker, but that's offset by households with no workers, retirees. So on average, the benchmark is you want to be generating basically 1 new housing unit for every 1 new job that's created. So again, the state is falling short systematically year after year by adding less housing units per jobs created. And when you go into the major booming economic market of Charlotte with the financial services industry and all of the job creation and innovation that's going on in the city, you'll find that the picture is even bleaker with 3 jobs being created, but only 1 corresponding home being built. These are contributors to those shrinking inventories that were mentioned earlier on this call. From a rental perspective, 1-bedroom unit affordability as a percentage of AMI or area median income has escalated no matter if you're in Charlotte, Greensboro, or Raleigh. The lack of affordable rental options have many negative consequences on the economy as renters look to transition into home ownership. Saving for a down payment while paying off student debt for those millennials becomes increasingly difficult. And on the homeownership side, we've seen a real depletion in the availability of entry-level starter homes. This is data from the American Enterprise Institute that looks at 2012 versus 2018, the share of entry-level homes as a percentage of all new homes. And you'll see that the top line number is effectively that in that 6-year period, new starter homes have essentially halved from 18% of new construction being starter homes in 2012 to 10% of starter homes in 2018. Now, the driver for that significant decline in starter homes is clearly land prices, but it's also the artificial barriers that we're going to get into that inhibit enough rental housing from getting built. So it really is an ecosystem with the lack of availability and affordability of rental homes impairing the ability of potential home buyers to save up for that first down payment, and the same barriers that inhibit rental production from happening are in fact inhibiting for sale production from happening. And when it does happen, for sale has to be priced at a higher price point to enable the builders to pencil those new developments. And to further build on that point, this is another data set from the American Enterprise Institute that looks at comparing the share of starter homes that were affordable in 2012 versus 2018. So in a way, this is a little bit different way to look at the same point. The Carpenter's Index looks at that share. Each dot on the chart represents the top 100 metro areas across the U.S. And the chart plots 2012 versus 2018. So the 45-degree axis represents no change, as was the case in Greensboro. But in Charlotte and Raleigh, those markets both experienced decreased affordability, where in 2018, less than half of starter homes are affordable to middle-income households. Now, these aren't low-income affordable buyers. These are folks in the workforce, teachers, firemen, police officers. The North Carolina markets are typical of the national trend of worsening affordability, with most markets falling below the line, meaning decreased affordability over time. So historically, from a policy perspective, there's been a trade-off with managing growth. Cities that are geographically constrained could either become more expensive or not actively seek to grow their populations to keep housing costs low. So San Francisco really seems to not care about affordability. They're geographically constrained. They're creating tons of jobs, but they're not able to tamp, and so they're not able to tamp prices down. In fact, San Francisco, going back to the jobs to housing ratio that I mentioned earlier, like Charlotte, is not keeping pace with their job creations, but their ratio is much more extreme, 11 jobs created for every one new home built. It's no surprise that employers are fleeing the Bay Area in California more broadly in terms of more affordable housing markets around the country. On the other end of the policy trade-off spectrum are expansive cities, cities that rather than accept rapidly escalating housing costs as their populations grow, they continue to expand their boundaries. Now, Las Vegas is a classic example where it is able to freely expand into the desert. Now, there's infrastructure cost considerations which ultimately do serve as a governor as to how rapidly any community can expand geographically. But markets like Raleigh, Austin, Atlanta, even Charlotte fall traditionally into that end of the policy trade-off, accepting more sprawl and more physical growth of the community in order to accommodate an increasing population. But we would posit that there's a third paradigm for how to approach the trade-off, which Up for Growth calls accessible growth, which can accommodate growth by increasing housing supply without a commensurate increase in land area. This is also known as increasing density. But what stops density? Our research and experience across the country finds that it's a certain set of policy choices, often referred to as artificial barriers to housing production or regulatory barriers or simply red tape. A certain set of policy choices makes it difficult for builders who are otherwise incentivized to build more housing to do so, to meet demand. In states like California that have a severe underproduction of homes to the tune of 3.4 million as calculated from 2000 to 2015, the elasticity of housing supply, which is, to simply think about it, the percentage to which the housing supply increases relative to the same percentage of change in demand for housing. So a perfectly elastic housing market would be a one-to-one. Let's call it 1. California's elasticity is 0.5. North Carolina's elasticity, by contrast, is higher. I believe it's in the 0.7% range. Now, over time, what that results in is an underproduction. And to further elaborate on that point, the lower the elasticity ratio is for a market, the higher we find the regulatory barriers are. There's an index that Wharton puts out every so often, once every 5 to 10 years or so. It's the Wharton Land Use Regulation Index, or WRLI. And it turns out if you correlate the WRLI index, which is the extent to which regulatory barriers are high or low in different cities, and you correlate that to the housing elasticity, there's a very high correlation between those two metrics. So, essentially we can say that the higher the regulatory barriers, the lower the elasticity of housing supply, which would mean the higher the shortage of homes, which would mean the less affordable and available housing is in those particular markets. So we've spent quite a bit of time in North Carolina as an organization, and specifically in the city of Charlotte. And we worked with the city of Charlotte, Mecklenburg County, a whole variety of stakeholders across the community advocacy perspective, as well as builders, organizations like REBEC and the Apartment Association and the home builders. And we worked together with this cross-sector group to develop the Up for Growth Housing Policy and Affordability Calculator. Now, any of you can go onto upforgrowth.org and check out this site. And what it essentially allows anyone to do is to understand different policy trade-offs. To the extent that there are higher open space requirements, or to the extent that there are additional months of delay in obtaining a building permit, or to the extent that there are higher upfront fees or costs associated with the production of each new unit of housing, this calculator allows anyone to see what's the impact on rent over time for day one new construction, how does that translate into broader market affordability outcomes, and importantly, how does it translate into more or fewer units getting built over a forecast period of time? In this calculator, we look at a forecast period of 3 years. And so the idea here is that it is a tool to enable policymakers to understand what specific barriers are helpful at eliminating or streamlining in order to create an environment where housing producers can build more housing and really get at that underproduction issue that we spoke about a bit ago. So from a policy perspective, I'll just stop for a moment and say our view is that this housing underproduction in Charlotte or Greensboro or Raleigh or nationwide can't be tackled from a project by project basis. In fact, looking at the history, many of these policies that prevent needed housing getting built in places of high demand or product types of high demand have been erected not over years, but over decades, in many cases extending even before the 1950s. And so really our perspective is policymakers should be looking at reversing those historic policy decisions and streamlining and eliminating unnecessary barriers to housing, so that as communities grow, they can really push forward on that third paradigm that I described, accessible growth, increasing the supply in zone capacity for housing, and really getting at meeting demand in a more responsive way that's happening today. Builders can't address this themselves. Builders try as hard as they might to build as many homes. In fact, their incentives are very much aligned with the notion of meeting demand. But despite that, we've fallen further into a housing deficit position over the years nationally, and again, in many places in North Carolina. So we think that in addition to, of course, builders and folks in the real estate space leaning in on advocating for reducing supply, policymakers at all levels of government have a duty to work to eliminate these barriers so that we can achieve ultimately more equitable housing outcomes, so that we can achieve more housing affordability and availability nationwide. So we really sort of think about what policymakers can do based on each level of government. Now, the rubber hits the road on many of these issues at the local level. We have seen across the country, particularly in recent years, a number of efforts by cities and counties and regions across the country to advance policies that reduce things like impact fees, the upfront often per unit charge to develop housing. In fact, we had an interview with the Wall Street Journal several weeks ago, who, as many of you know, really cover this issue of the housing shortage and affordability crisis, about actions taken by the city of Santa Ana, California, where they had a $15 per foot, essentially impact fee on any new housing built in the city. And what they found is that over the past several years, they haven't kept up with their peers in Southern California that didn't have such high a fee. And so that city council actually voted just a couple months ago to reduce that fee from $15 per square foot to $5 per square foot. And the quote from the city councilor who moved that vote was, we need to catalyze more housing production, especially now when we in the nation find ourselves in an economic recession coming from the COVID pandemic and associated containment efforts. We also have seen communities actively work to streamline building permit and approval processes. And I think the city of Charlotte is a good example where the city of Charlotte and Mecklenburg County have come together to try to create a one-stop shop and try to find some efficiencies in order to reduce that period of time that it takes to bring new housing to market. And finally, other jurisdictions looking at establishing development permissions as of right, meaning it's ministerial, there's no discretionary public process where folks adverse to new housing can come in and stop housing dead in its tracks. And in particular, we've seen very strong efforts on that front in places like Minnesota and Oregon and Virginia. From a statewide perspective, we have seen state legislatures becoming more actively involved in really two things. One, creating some minimum standards for housing density. So just like states create minimum standards around education, each local school district doesn't necessarily decide how many days a year they're open. States have started to say we should set some minimum standards around housing. And so we've seen states as far and wide as Maryland and Nebraska and Washington start to advance legislation that would say, for instance, any single family lot can be built out as a duplex, or to the extent that there are high opportunity sites located along transit. And I know that this was included in Charlotte's recent zoning update, setting ministerial density bonuses or density by right for the production of the type of lockable housing options that so many millennials and baby boomers are seeking these days. And then the other element is fair share requirements. So to the extent that a community is actively holding up housing from moving forward, if they are not meeting certain affordability threshold targets, projects are deemed approved. And we've seen that type of legislation advance in Massachusetts. In fact, Massachusetts was the first state to pass such legislation in 1969. But more recently, states far and wide, Arizona and Oregon have taken up similar approaches from a legislative perspective. And so, the state and local levels are really where the rubber hits the road on these policy solutions, but so many states and localities have challenged moving forward pro-housing policies, despite the clear need for housing, that we believe the federal government has a role to provide leadership, to provide the means and reasons and resources for states and local governments to advance such pro-housing policies. So there's a balance between local control and leadership. In one bill in particular that our organization has been working on for the past several months is a bill called the Yes in My Backyard Act. It's a bipartisan bill that really shines a spotlight on local housing and land use policy decisions. It's bipartisan. It's sponsored by Senator Todd Young, a Republican from Indiana, and Senator Brian Schatz, a Democratic member from Hawaii, both who have come together and said, we have a housing crisis because we don't have enough homes. And we need to encourage local governments to advance policies to really break down those barriers so that the builders can do what they do best, which is build housing for the folks that they need it, up and down the income spectrum. And so this is a bill that I'm proud to report that the National Association of Realtors, as well as the North Carolina Realtors, have publicly endorsed. In fact, we have an endorsement list of over 200 organizations across the country who are supporting this legislation. And ultimately, what it will do is it will create a framework for local governments and state governments to have a conversation about advancing many of those state and local policies that I described earlier, and really take a constructive role in addressing our shortage of homes around the country. So finally, just from a takeaway perspective, as I mentioned earlier, our research has found that in the most populated areas of North Carolina, the production of housing has clearly not kept pace with household formation. The cost of entry-level homes are increasing, and more broadly, fewer homes are being built in the face of increasing demand. In long run, affordability, as we know through our research, requires the sustained production of housing units. And not only that, but we have an imperative to catch up with that huge underproduction that accumulated from 2000 to 2015. And to get that more production, policymakers must prioritize removing barriers. Now, I often say that our housing crisis is the result of a certain set of policy choices. And while the problem is complex, and while it's not going to be solved overnight, it just requires political will, and it requires a different set of policy choices. And I just say that North Carolina has that opportunity, particularly as the state continues to remain economically competitive, as it remains creating jobs. It has the opportunity to leverage its investments in infrastructure and transit, and places and communities that are growing with jobs, to build units at lower costs in accessible and high opportunity neighborhoods. And that's going to be key, not only to addressing the affordability challenge, creating economic activity, creating jobs, but also to increasing equity in the region. So thank you very much for the opportunity. It's been a real pleasure to share our thoughts and perspectives with this group, and I do look forward to taking questions.
All right, so thank you for that. I'm over here taking notes. That's why it took me a minute. That was fantastic. And we actually have a slew of questions. I'm running them on my screen here. I've got an active Google Doc. So bear with me if I miss your question. I'm also going to be trying to hit the Q&As as we have time. Great. So let's get going because we have a few minutes. So first question, and this is, so this is me talking here, but you paint a cautionary picture of housing availability in a whole in North Carolina. It's actually kind of terrifying. We've heard the horror stories about how the middle class is completely being priced out of some cities on the West Coast and the Northeast. And frankly, I'm born and raised in the Charlotte region, and I'm seeing here what's happening, and I'm going, are we going to be like them? And what does that look like? And how can we prevent that? Or is it too late?
I think in many ways, Charlotte is a beneficiary of the unaffordability in places like New York City and Boston and DC. And I'm sure you've seen that in terms of the flocking of financial services folks to expanding on
Absolutely.
And other major employers. And so I think in some ways this national crisis does create an opportunity for the state. But as you say, you are starting to go down the same path that so many other cities across the country have gone down. But I think that's why I believe that the state has an opportunity to make that different set of policy choices earlier on in that curve. If cities across the state act to change zoning law to allow for more of the type of modern housing product that so many homebuyers are looking for. If cities focus on streamlining building permissions so more units can get built quicker to better meet demand, you're going to be in a very good position to continue to be successful in economic development efforts. And frankly, and I look at this from a national perspective. Every single economic recession, going all the way back to the Depression, obviously, except for the last one, has been driven by housing production driving the way in terms of creating jobs, in terms of creating economic activity, in terms of driving economic recovery. And so I think couched from that standpoint, from a statewide perspective, even from a local government perspective, I think there's a very strong case to be made to move these pro-housing policies forward.
Thank you. And we've got even more rolling in. So here's a good one right here. One of the biggest ways to offer affordable housing options is accessory dwelling units, but the local zoning ordinances do not offer flexibility for these types of housing options. How can we convince or persuade local municipalities to modify their ordinances?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question. Up for Growth has done quite a bit of policy work around the issue of legalizing accessory dwelling units, from statewide legislation in California to city-specific legislation, in places like Charlotte and Minneapolis and Austin, Texas. Now, I think there's an economic case to be made that allowing the construction of more accessory dwelling units will create create economic activity, create jobs, meet pent-up demand. I also think that there's a more personal case to be made in terms of with increasing unaffordability, particularly in close-in neighborhoods, Charlotte, Raleigh, et cetera. As people age and look for opportunities to downsize but not move too far away, or as your kids are graduating from college and looking for their first place, I think that ADUs provide that kind of missing middle availability that is very difficult to find. Not everybody wants to live in a studio or a one-bedroom apartment in the downtown, and not every senior necessarily wants to move to a multifamily situation. Many would like to live and remain close to their families, and I think ADUs really provide that opportunity.
I think you hit the nail on the head. I mean, I'm the perfect example of that. God forbid my children actually come back. I don't know if they will, but I'm actually planning on my parents living in a little casita, which is what they call them out west, right? Out back of my house one day. So, I mean, I think this is a true trend that's going to continue. And I think it actually is with the baby boomers more than anybody that we're going to see this really pick up. So I think you're right on that. I think they're all going to invest in the property at the same time together, but that's a totally different topic. All right. So what does this all mean if it's not too late for us? Meaning, let's be positive for a change. If we do everything right, what can this mean for our state and our region?
It will turbocharge the ability for the state and the region to create jobs, attract new employers to the area, because you better believe every major employer in Silicon Valley across the state of California, and as our experience have found, even in places like Boise, Idaho, which have been a net attractor of jobs, they're even becoming more unaffordable. And so to the extent that Charlotte in the state as a whole is successful in really enacting and advancing a pro-housing agenda to create an extremely responsive home building market to housing needs, the economic development potential can be tremendous. On top of that, if you are successful at meeting housing needs through eliminating artificial barriers to housing, it's going to create huge benefits from a livability and quality of life perspective, further making the state an attractive destination for many. And it would potentially even yield environmental benefits by better meeting needs and reducing the need for folks to drive until they qualify. And the last piece that I'll say is that I'm just reading the Wall Street Journal, I believe from yesterday or a couple days ago, about the housing shortage in the context of the pandemic, and the headlines: Americans want more homes, but there have rarely been fewer for sale. The inventory shortage is very real. There are a whole lot of folks who want to buy that first house, and to the extent that North Carolina is successful in really eliminating barriers to housing, it's going to make rental housing more affordable, which is going to create a pipeline of future home buyers and hopefully address that gap in terms of home ownership rates versus pre-global financial crisis in the early 2000s. So I think it's a policy imperative for many reasons outside of simply the rental affordability discussion. And ultimately, I think success in advancing pro-housing policy will result in just a healthier housing ecosystem overall.
So I'm seeing what's happening across the country with, and it's spun multiple ways with the media spinning it one way or the other, right? That they're doing away with single family zoning, and oh no, you won't be able to have a single family home in that overlay anymore. And I'd love for you to just touch on that and maybe dispel some of that and go into what that really means for the local areas.
Yeah. I mean, Ed Pinto, who's a researcher at American Enterprise Institute, he's on our advisory board, and he's done a lot of work on this issue. And, the reality is what we're talking about when we talk about ADUs or casitas or even duplexes or triplexes is building the way we used to, building American communities the way we did in the 1950s and the 1940s. You know, you think about the Mayberry, the town square, you think about Brooklyn, you think about, you know, old close-in neighborhoods, even in Charlotte, Asheville, North Carolina. You know, you see a wider array of housing types than you have seen produced in the 1980s, 1990s, and in the 2000s, even today in many places, right? So what we're really talking about is returning to a bygone era where a greater diversity of housing was built that just better met all of these differing consumer needs and preferences for different types of housing. It really creates a more flexible and adaptable and in many ways interesting way of community development. So, you know, I think we have seen broad bipartisan support for the notion of eliminating exclusively single-family zoning, because ultimately it boils down to property rights, and it just boils down to smart community growth, and that's really, you know, what we're talking about. So we're actually optimistic from a national perspective and about the conversation going on in states about this, because we do think that there is a growing clamor for more housing and a greater diversity of housing. And frankly, you know, what we're talking about will really enhance the livability in the suburbs themselves, and you know, in many ways make suburbs more responsive and competitive in these changing times.
Well, ultimately, that's code for walkable. I mean, I think that that's part of where we're going with it. And you touched on national, so I think this is actually a good question to wrap up on. What is going on nationally? We've talked about local measures, things we can do in place. What is going on nationally around all these efforts, and what should we know about that?
Well, there is a growing bipartisan coalition, as I mentioned earlier, on the Yes in My Backyard Act in particular, but that's not the only bill. There have been a number of pieces of legislation. One of the other federal bills that our organization helped write and worked on beginning the last year and into this year is a bill called the Build More Housing Near Transit Act. And that actually aligns with a lot of the work that Charlotte in particular has been doing, and I know is in the thinking process up in Raleigh area as well, around Duke. So, you know, I'm not going to sit here and say a lot's going to move through the balance of the year, but the reality is, versus 3 years ago, the federal government has really recognized that the housing underproduction is a major issue, and Congress has found ways to advance legislation that will really support states and local governments to tackle this issue. Because, you know, as we've seen throughout the course of this housing crisis that's been, you know, a couple of decades in the making, cities and states struggle to do this on their own. And the federal government can be a really helpful partner. So we do expect in the coming years that a number of Up for Growth Action and NAR endorsed pro-housing bills will move through Congress, and we will start to see positive impact happening, and of course impact happening in states and cities around the country. So happy to be a resource and a gateway for that type of information. And of course, if there's any questions after this conference, don't hesitate to reach out to Up for Growth. You can find us at www.upforgrowth.org. And of course, we're on Twitter, and we tweet a lot about federal activity, and that's at @4growth.
I don't even know. I feel like Twitter's a bad word these days almost, isn't it? But that's awesome. And I want to extend a true thank you for being here with us today, Mike. This has been a pleasure. And I actually have a full page of questions that I am going to send your way, because I'd love to filter the answers out to our members. And with that, I'd like to join everyone else in a virtual applause, since everything's virtual this year. And thank you. And that is all for this session. I really appreciate you, Mike.
All right. Thank you, everybody.